Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. I've been talking about for the past couple months, and I'm going to do a video on what I consider my legal test for space debris, and today is that day. I've kind of worked up a small presentation for this, and just to give you an idea of some of my thoughts on space debris and how it should be defined. Now, I really don't like the idea of, quote, defining space debris, because that means there's just this one solid definition that to define what space debris is or what space debris isn't. And I mean, for example, the UAE space law that I talked about back in April, they have actually in the law, they have actually defined space debris. But the problem is it's too limiting, and really the idea of space debris is really kind of complicated, and it really doesn't, one definition doesn't really fit everything. It just leaves too many loopholes and potential ambiguities that really can't be filled. So my approach to this has been, instead of defining what space debris in this definition, how about presenting space debris what space debris is as a legal test? In other words, taking the idea of defining what space debris is, not through a single definition, but through a test, or what we call a totality of the circumstances test in the legal field. Now, I actually worked on something like this, and this presentation I'm going to go into in a few moments is actually based on an article I wrote back in 2012 for the Space Review. It was part of a three-part series on space debris, and the first installment of that, which I'll actually put a link to in the description of this video, was basically on defining space debris. And I listed 7 conditions for what might constitute space debris. Honestly, I haven't looked at that too hard for about 8 years since I wrote it, and I can't believe it's been 8 years since I actually wrote that. But I looked at it again in preparation for this video and decided that, I'm trying to refine it a little bit and make it more, instead of just, having conditions, I'm going to create what we call a legal test for space debris. So basically this presentation is going to be based on that particular article with some nuances. So without further ado, I'm going to go right to this, and we're going to use the magic of this program again. I really love this program. It's really awesome for making these videos. The legal test for space debris. So, like I said, in other words, I don't like the idea of a legal definition of space debris, because how are you going to define it? I mean, it's really difficult given the complexity of objects that are up there, and the idea of complete and perpetual ownership of space objects, and and we get this whole thing of salvage, which that's a word I don't like, and it's something I'll probably be talking about later on, or actually writing about a little bit. Some different semantics for that. So I'm looking at space debris as a legal test, and we'll get right into it here with the first factor. The idea is space debris is a space object. No matter space debris at its fundamental is always going to be a space object. I don't care if it's a piece of a fragment or a glove that an astronaut or cosmonaut dropped over the side during an EVA, or a fully functioning satellite, or an upper stage to a rocket. It's still going to be, those are still space objects as defined. And for this, I use the definition of space object found in the Liability Convention and the Registration Convention. And actually, these are the definition is identical in both of these. The term space object includes component parts of a space object as well as its vehicle and parts thereof. So in other words, it could be a whole rocket, or it could be just a small piece of a rocket. And this is actually interesting, because back in the 70s, when Cosmos 954, that Soviet Rosat that fell out of orbit and fell into Canadian territory, during the fracas between the Soviets and the Canadians on that, the general idea was the Soviets basically said, well, this is, because it's a wreckage, it isn't really a satellite or a space object anymore. And actually, the Canadians filed a grievance under the Liability Convention for strict liability, and the Soviets were trying to get out of liability by saying, well, it's not a whole space satellite or such, so it really isn't a space object. And pointing back to the language of the Liability Convention, it basically said, well, actually, it is. So that basically goes to components, parts thereof. So the Soviets actually acquiesced, say, okay, we agree it is a space object, and that kind of provided some solidification for that term in both those treaties, in the registration convention and in the liability convention. So understand, space debris, whether it's going to be a glove or an upper stage or, Elon Musk's Starship, once he gets in orbit, it's a space object. And that's going to be a fundamental for anything that we actually look at. The second part of this test, the second part we're going to consider is, does the space object continue to perform its original function? Does it have a tangible function or a function that is no longer required? So in other words okay, this is a space object. We want to determine whether it's space debris or not. One of the things we're going to ask is it performing its original function? For example, I'm taking a communication satellite that's been sitting up in orbit, and it was actually turned off by its operator because they don't need it, they don't have any use for it, or it's getting low on fuel, and they want to just get it out of the way. Question: is it space debris? This is one of the things we would consider. On the other hand, you have a fragment of a satellite or such that is still floating around up there in orbit, and it might be kind of hard to identify where it came from. But the question is it performing a tangible original function, or does it have a continuing function? Now, going back to my satellite example, there was the Intelsat satellite that was the subject of the MEV-1 mission that I talked about earlier this year. And basically, at one point, it was being put aside and out of service. However, with the MEV-1 project, MEV-1 came in and actually maneuvered it back into a workable orbit, and they turned it back on again. So the question is, it's still a space object. At one point, it could have been under this test. The question was, is it still continuing to perform its original function? No, but at the same time, because of the MEV-1 and moving into position and actually, providing some maneuvering capability and turning it back on, it really is performing its original function again. So it really couldn't be considered space debris. And even beforehand, when it was turned off, was it really space debris? Because, it may have had a tangible function at some point, or the question was it no longer required. Again, that would have been a test that we would have been considering in this. But at this point, because MEV-1 moved it back into a workable orbit and they turned it back on, it's a space object, but it probably wouldn't be considered space debris under this prong of this test. Has a space object either re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, remain in Earth orbit, outer space, or the moon or other celestial bodies? Now, the one thing about orbital space debris is we call it orbital space debris because we worry about stuff in LEO. We don't consider stuff, space objects that are, say, in interplanetary space or around other celestial bodies, including the moon, or on the moon, for that example, or even on Mars. A good example is the Viking spacecraft. The landers, both the lander and the orbiters that brought the landers to Mars, they're no longer functioning, but they're sitting on the celestial bodies. So, if you go back to the second part of the test, they don't perform their original function. They don't have a tangible function anymore, and they're really no longer required. So they're basically just sitting there. And the question is, have they re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, or do they remain on Earth's orbit, outer space, or the moon, or other celestial bodies? And the answer to that is yes. So in a sense, they kind of weighs in favor of them being space debris. And that's just an example on another celestial body. And of course, there are examples on the moon, and as well as just basically spacecraft that have entered heliocentric orbit that are no longer functioning. 4, was the space object created intentionally or through the actions or inactions of a launching state? Now, this gets tricky because basically you have a space object that may fit these upper two prongs 2 and 3 of this test. But the question is, whether or not that was created intentionally. Now, in the case of, for example, a good example is upper stage rockets. I mean, when they're done, they're boosting their satellite into geosynchronous orbit or even low Earth orbit. In most cases, they remain in orbit. So the question is, applying the prongs 2 and 3 along with this one, we can say, okay, this was pretty much this was actually created through the act of launching a satellite into orbit, and so it might be space debris depending on by applying some of these other prongs. It could, just by looking at that, it could actually weigh in favor of being space debris, these upper stages. Another one is ASAT testing. We have the 2003 China test. We have the killer satellite co-orbital test from the Soviet Union. There's still space debris around the Earth from those particular tests. And in that case, those space objects, the remains of those satellites, the remains of the satellites that were destroyed by the ASAT test, were created intentionally through those tests. So again, we got to look at these first two and three and kind of tie it into four. And a lot of this is weighing in favor of the object being space debris. And I understand this is complicated, and believe me, I've done a lot of thinking on this and how to present this. But once you get into the flow of it, you kind of understand where I'm going. This is kind of like a decision tree versus just looking at the big just looking at each individual prong of this test. Prong number 5: does a space object have economic value to a launching state? I think this is a good example because in a lot of cases you have, we're going to go back to communication satellites, especially in geosynchronous orbit. Those are extremely expensive assets. And most of the time when they get turned off, or basically no longer have a function, is because they are out of fuel and they have to be moved to a graveyard orbit. So in a sense, that these objects might be considered space debris. However, they still might have economic value to a launching state, or in the case of a private entity that launched them, that actually owns these things. They may still have an economic value, and that will go back to the Intelsat satellite that was recovered by MEV and put back into service. At one point, it was basically looked like it could be qualified under space debris under this test, but then again, it still had economic value, and that economic value was realized when the MEV-1 came and docked with it and moved it back to a position where they turned it back on again. They got 4 years extra life. I think it's 4 years extra life out of that spacecraft. So again, because it still has economic value, even though test prongs 2 through 4 might say, well, this is space debris, that economic value still weighs in favor of calling it, not classifying it as space debris. 6, does a space object have historical value to the launching state? And this is a big one lately, and this flies into the field of space archaeology in particular. I know there is a professor friend of mine in Australia who basically fields this area of space archaeology, and there's another professor, I believe at the University of Arizona, who works in this field also. And it's kind of a growing field. And the idea is, all these spacecraft that are sitting out there, they do have value from a historical standpoint. So in other words, even though a space object, say for example, an old weather, there was one satellite, the name eludes me, that's been a U.S. satellite that's been sitting in orbit for decades, and it's the oldest object launched by the United States, and it's basically still spinning around the globe. And the idea is, under the prongs 2 through 4, actually 2 through 4, basically we could consider, this weighs into basically being space debris. However, if you look at number 6 and you look from a historical perspective and saying, well, no, this really has some historical value. Maybe we don't want to classify it quite as space debris at this point because of that historical value. And again, that's another fly in the ointment with this because, this, like I said, this area of space archaeology is growing. These things represent decades-old technology in some cases, and you may not want to, carte blanche say, well, it's space junk. We don't need to, we don't have to worry about it, or, we'll have to deal with it at some other point. And finally, the 7th prong: does a space object contain some sort of national security value to a launching state? And this is a really tricky one, and this falls into photo reconnaissance satellites, and even the radar satellites and other national security assets. The whole idea is, do you want to classify these? All these other functions, all the other prongs might apply to it and weigh in favor of being space debris, but because of national security reasons, you may not want to quite label it as space debris. And this has a lot to do with legal areas and kind of planning for the future when this idea of space debris mitigation actually comes into play. So this is a really quick test that I laid out for creating space debris. I know it's kind of confusing, and I understand that, but this is what we call, again, a totality of the circumstances test. So why do this? Why go through the complexity of going through this analysis? Well, for one thing, space debris is something that's going to be addressed eventually, and there's going to be eventually some sort of liability is going to be had about space debris, whether or not, it should be cleaned up. And the idea is you got to be able, you want to be sure you want to classify something as space debris before you classify it as such, because it might actually go, open up a huge can of worms, both legally and financially, for the launching state. So the idea is, this test will probably give a government or even a company the idea of, look, this is how we can determine whether or not this asset is still something we should keep on the books, or basically, say, okay, it's space debris, and down the road when the space debris remediation activities start in earnest, we can actually get rid of it. Another idea this has goes for the idea of salvage, or what I'm going to call reclamation at this point. Some of these assets have a lot of value, maybe not to its current owner, but to another owner who might want to take it and repurpose it. Whether one of these in-orbit servicing missions like the MEV goes in and actually repairs the satellite and refuels it, or that the ownership is transferred to another. That's a consideration. Is this junk? Does this have an economic value? Do we want to get rid of it? Or in the case of these reconnaissance birds or national security assets, does this have a national security significance? Do we want to actually let somebody else have it, or we want to get rid of it as soon, so that nobody else can get a hold of it? Or do we want to classify it as space debris and kind of keep it, sort of active, some sort of active space object, so that we don't run into it doesn't fall into other legal areas for remediation or basically reclamation. So, and a lot of this gets into the idea of, they're basically at some point, this is going to come down to, whether or not, these objects are considered abandoned or not. And that's a whole other can of worms I'm not even going to get into in this video, because I haven't even thought it through completely yet. But it's something that I think is going to go through. Where else would this be useful? This would be useful in a court of law. And I've been doing a lot of work lately on actually, merging international space law and what's going on and dispute resolution with the federal courts. And in fact, I have an article that's co-authored an article on the topic that's going to be coming out in November in the Vanderbilt Journal of Technology and Entertainment Law. So we just finished up, my co-author and I, we just finished that up. We sent in the final draft yesterday. So we're both pretty excited about, having that published and seeing it. But that's another area, because courts really love these totality of the circumstances tests. And I do too. And the idea is you got to weigh all these factors, and all these factors are basically, the idea is not, and one factor may weigh more heavily than the other factor in determining it. So, when you get down to it, there are thousands of space objects up there, and how do states or companies even start sorting through all these and doing this? This is very time intensive. And I was actually giving some thought about this before this video, and one of the things you might actually be able to do is employ artificial intelligence to actually program it to look through and kind of parse through all these steps, or modification of these steps, to determine, okay, what space objects do we want to catalog as, active space objects that we really want to, basically protect, versus classify as space debris. And like I said, artificial intelligence is very quick, and you can program it heuristically to actually make these determinations. And that would be one application of artificial intelligence in this case, whether it be for the government and the national security apparatus, or for commercial industries, or for separate states when they're evaluating their terms. I don't see this being an international test. It could be potentially, I don't know, but it's not an easy test. It's more conducive to a courtroom litigious environment, or an AI environment, where basically you're using it as a tool to determine what assets you want to keep active, versus say, okay, this is just trash. So that's it in a nutshell for my legal test for space debris. I've been promising for a few months, and I promised one subscriber in particular that I would do this. It's complicated, I understand, and I put a lot of thought into this. Like I said, this is 8 years in the making. This is actually the result of off and on 8 years of thinking, and it's still not quite there. I haven't really written a paper on it, and I don't know if I'm going to, because, well, time constraints. We're all busy with our own projects. But basically, that is my legal test for space debris. I welcome your comments in the comment section. I'll gladly answer them. And I got a lot of other videos I want to do. I'm really looking to get forward into doing a few more. Going to try and do them every other week at this point. Well, it's summer, folks, and I really like to get outside too on top of my other work. So again, I hope you're safe and I hope you're healthy, and go out and enjoy the weather as best you can. And I will talk to you next time.